Ma'am.
Good afternoon. Hi, Sarath.
Ma'am. Good afternoon.
Back in form, Sarath. டார்க்கா இருக்கு சரத் உன்னோட இது பேக்ரவுண்ட்.
Light port.
Now it's bright. Back to work, Sarath?
Yes, madam. Since last Wednesday.
Okay, good. So Abhinesh is relaxed now. Relieved rather than relieved.
He is on his own, ma'am. Right now, he can run the department individually, including bronchoscopy.
That's good. That's good.
Including opinions.
Yeah, great.
Can run department on his own.
Yeah. Good. Abhinesh is good.
Hi, ma'am. Padma here, ma'am.
Hi, Padma.
Yes, ma'am. How are you, ma'am? Fine. Terliyo naan. Satya will be presenting for me.
Okay.
Yes.
Nisha?
No. Dr. Satya will be presenting for me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Dr. Satya is presenting. Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hi, ma'am.
Hi. Meena. 2 minutes.
You're still not seen, but
Yeah, ma'am. Now I kept it for Satya so that for her, kept it for Satya's view. She's yet to join me.
okay.
Just focused it that way.
Okay, fine.
Abhi.
Ma'am, can I check if the slides are playing?
Sure, ma'am. Sure. You can share your slides, ma'am.
Okay, sir.
Myself, sir.
Illa. Madam. Beena, ma'am.
Is it playing, sir?
No, I play. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I think that should be okay.
Seen.
Okay.
Put slideshow alone.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. I think that should do.
Vanita. What is that? Vanita from Srihar. Can you share your slides and see, ma? Presenter Dr. Vanita from
I don't think
Ramachandra.
she's there. Yeah, don't think she's there. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Padma Balaji. Madam,
Yes,
can you
Satya.
share your slides, ma'am? She's also not there. Edison, just share your slides, ma'am.
Edison, share your slides, Edison. Edison? Yeah.
Are you able to hear me, ma'am?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Put slide share. Sorry,
Shared.
slideshow, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
Abhirami, Dr. Abhirami from Apollo.
Yes, sir. I'm going to share my slides.
Done.
Is this visible, sir?
Visible, audible, good.
Okay, sir. Thanks.
Yeah.
Nisha
Nisha is there, yeah. Nisha, she was there only. She just. Yeah, Nisha, share your screen.
Good afternoon, ma'am and sir. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah.
Audible. Slides need to be visible. Share your slide.
1 second, sir.
Done.
Thank you, sir.
Abhi. Abhinesh. Okay.
Yeah, he's carrying.
Okay, da.
Abhinesh, why don't you talk? We'll check your audio also.
Unmute ரா. ஹலோ. வர ஒரு மீட்டிங்ல இருக்குங்க. 1.5 மணி நேரம்.
Hello.
நல்லா
Audible,
இருக்கு.
ma'am?
நல்லா இருக்கு.
Audible, sir? Am I audible?
Yeah. Audible. Little louder, Abhinesh.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, now it's okay. Fine.
Abhi at home and Abhi at department are quite contrasting, ma'am, for me.
Hmm. Gavin Frederick also has to share it.
Yes, ma'am.
Almost all same PG faces.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah. You're from Stanley, no, Gavin?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Oh, the
Okay.
last week present are right.
Okay, fine.
Good afternoon and welcome, Janani, back to Chennai.
Yeah.
Abhirami Apollo, are you there? Dr.
Yes.
Abhirami,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I'm there.
slides, please.
She shared.
I shared, sir, previously.
She already shared. Only Rainbow has to share. ICH is over. Child's Trust over. Srihan and
Minus
Rainbow
Seena,
has to
ma'am.
share. Yeah, just start.
Are my slides visible?
Audible, visible, you can proceed.
Thank you very much. I thank IAP for giving me an opportunity to present at this forum. So I am going to speak on the infantile presentation of an adult onset disorder. So the history is as follows. A second gravida was referred for ultrasound and genetic counseling at 19 weeks of pregnancy because they had lost their previous child with developmental delay at 2.5 years of age. They were a consanguineous couple. And going back to the history, we noted that the antenatal period was uneventful for the first child. There were decreased fetal movements, but Laika was within normal limits. The lady had a term vaginal delivery. She delivered a 3 kg female baby who cried well after birth. There were no neonatal complications. At 3 months, the child had a good social smile. She could recognize the mother. She could follow objects, but no head control. So this was the child, no major dysmorphism. At 5th month, still no head control, but there were episodes of abnormal and excessive cry. New onset of myoclonic jerks. The mother noticed that there was loss of social smile and the child had become lethargic. At 8 months, she was noted to be a floppy infant, was not following light, microcephaly and hypotonia. Her seizures increased in frequency from 2 years. She had recurrent aspiration pneumonia and succumbed at 2.5 years. Among the investigations that were available, a tandem mass spectrometry was done which showed no significant abnormality. EEG showed burst suppression pattern. Opthal evaluation was normal and echo was also normal. So looking at the MRI, so this MRI was taken at 5 months and it was normal, whereas an MRI done at the age of 2 years showed diffuse cerebral, cerebellar and brainstem atrophy. The cerebellar involvement was much more severe than the cerebral involvement. So this was all the information that we had, and now we had a lot of counseling dilemmas, mainly because the mother was now 19 weeks of pregnancy, a consanguineous couple, possibly neuroregressive disorder, very likely to be an autosomal recessive one, but unfortunately No molecular diagnosis established till that time, and no sample stored from the baby tube, except luckily the filter paper card of the TMS, the dry blood spot, was available with the parent. So while we were asking about the detailed history, whether any other family member had similar problems or anything else in the family, slowly this history of a husband having some gait abnormalities came out. So we called the husband for an evaluation, and we found that he had ataxia, a scanning type of speech, ocular movement abnormality, tremors, dysarthria, clearly cerebellar symptoms with brisk reflexes, and he had an onset around 8 years back. So suspicion of spinocerebellar ataxia, and on taking a detailed pedigree, we found that his sister also had similar symptoms but much milder. His mother was noted to have symptoms which started around 30 years and she died by 45 years of age. The husband's grandfather also had similar symptoms, but the onset was at 70 years. On probing further, reluctantly he said, yes, he was evaluated genetically and was found to have SCA type 2, spinocerebellar ataxia type 2, with a proven genetic mutation. So here, this type of SCA type 2 is because of increase in the number of repeats. Normal repeats in a person should be less than 33. So here it is 40, and that is the reason. Now this set us thinking, could this spinocerebellar ataxia have a role in the previous child's issue? So till now we were thinking it could be a recessive disorder. With this information, we were thinking whether it could be, whether this spinocerebellar ataxia could have a link to it. So now let's just go into it. It's the commonest subtype in India, autosomal dominant, and an adult onset cerebellar ataxia. The onset is very variable, but the severe ones present around 2nd to 4th decade, followed by slow worsening and death. It is caused by an abnormal triplet repeat, CAG repeat, in exon 1 of ATXN2. So this abnormal including the pons, basal ganglia, and the cortex. So does this have an infantile onset? Yes, we did a literature search and found that it was very rare. Only 10 cases have been reported, 10 reports in literature till date, and there has been a report from India in 2014. So they had summarized the features of an infantile presentation. So developmental delay, neuroregression, hypotonia, seizures, most commonly infantile spasms. All these features were present in our child also. Visual impairment, retinitis pigmentosa and optic atrophy, dystonic features, and early death. MRI showed cerebellar, cerebral, brainstem atrophy, and ventricular enlargement. So how does the phenotype differ? While some of them are affected at 70, 40, and some in infancy. So how does this happen? So the basic mechanism here is the length of the CAG repeats. So as I told before, less than 33 is normal. Those people having a repeat between 30 to 33 are known to be at risk for something called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Parkinsonism, while those who have more than or equal to 33 have frank spinocerebellar ataxia type 2. Even in those people who have classical SCA, the maximum number of repeats has been up to 50 or maximum 55. So when the number of repeats expand to 100 or even 200, it presents much earlier as a juvenile or infantile phenotype. So here we need to understand a few terms. Anticipation. So dominant disorder, especially these repeats, are known to have anticipation, where the disease becomes much more severe in subsequent generations and they have a very early onset of disease. And there is an inverse relationship between the size of the repeats, age of onset, and severity, meaning larger the number of repeats, earlier the onset, and more severe is the disease. So coming back to our patient, based on the literature review, the MRI review, so we were quite clear that the previous child could have had an infantile presentation of SCA type 2. So we tried to extract the DNA from the available filter paper, the DBS card, and plan to go ahead with PCR of the protein. But then this had technical difficulties of extracting from the filter paper, and as the pregnancy was already 19 weeks, we proceeded directly with the prenatal for spinocerebellar ataxia. So this was the prenatal report. So the repeats from the amniotic fluid, as you can see here, are 19. So the normal number of repeats will be less than 33. So this was a normal report. But can we take it as normal? So from literature, what we read was that when we expect a massive expansion, it may not be always picked up by a routine PCR. So we picked this up with a lab again and asked them to repeat by another technique. Luckily, this lab had the facility for it, and they used a technique called TP-PCR, which they commonly use for testing fragile eggs, where they expect massively expanded repeats. So they reran the sample by TP-PCR, and the fetus was found to have a massive expansion of the SCA2 repeats, CAG2 repeats. So the fetus was affected, and thereby we could help the family to come to a conclusion regarding the outcome of this pregnancy. Since the fetus was at risk of being affected, the family did not want to continue the pregnancy, and they had planned for a termination. A month down the lane, the index child's DNA was also extracted, and initially a PCR was done which did not pick up the allele, and TP-PCR was done which picked up a massively expanded allele, confirming the diagnosis in the index child also, thereby completing the loop. So I wish to conclude by saying that spinocerebellar ataxia type 2 is the commonest spinocerebellar ataxia in India. A detailed family history is very important. So the presence of hypotonia, developmental delay, visual impairment and seizures, along with the presence of ataxia in family members, should raise the suspicion of SCA type 2. Massively expanded alleles, as was seen in our family, can be missed by regular PCR, which has been used day in and day out for diagnosis of SCA type 2 or any SCA for that matter, which are caused by repeats, and therefore in these situations we should consider a technique called TP-PCR or triple prime PCR. Pre-pregnancy counseling is very important. It will help us to counsel the family better. So I wish to bring this case for discussion because SCA being quite common, it's very likely that these children will come to a pediatrician's purview, and it's very important to be aware of this condition so as not to miss it, as exome sequencing will not pick up these repeat disorders and we need specialized techniques. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the emphasis given on TP-PCR as well as the role of genetic counseling. Questions will be asked at the end of the session, ma'am. Thanks for your nice presentation. And the next presenter, Dr. Deepthi, I think. Okay, Ranjit, is it Deepthi?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Dr. Deepthi from Department of Neurology, Srihar, Ramachandra Medical College, and it is a case of a rare and treatable cause of extreme clumsiness and a movement disorder in a child. Over to you, Dr. Deepthi. The stage is yours. Please share your screen, unmute yourself.
Sir, I'm not able to share my screen.
I think ma'am had stopped screening. You need to share. It should be possible for you to. Yeah, we are viewing.
Sir, is it visible now?
Go for proceed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Myself, Dr. Deepthi Keval Ramani. I'm an observer in pediatric neurology under Dr. Ranjit Kumar. I'm going to present an interesting case of a rare and treatable cause of extreme clumsiness and movement disorder in a child under the guidance of Dr. Ranjit Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of Neurology, Division of Pediatric Neurology, Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education Research. So our case is a 9-year-old boy who was brought by parents to Pediatric Neurology Division of our hospital with chief complaints of unsteady and clumsy gait noticed since early childhood. He was the firstborn and only child of a non-consanguineous union. His mother had an uneventful antenatal period. He was born full term via normal vaginal delivery, cried immediately after birth. He had neonatal hyperbilirubinemia on day 3 of life, which resolved on phototherapy, and there was no other significant family history elicited. So our child presented with a history of delayed development, but I'm sorry, I do not have specific development details as the mother was not available for the history. The father told that the child started walking independently by nearly 18 months of age, but had an unsteady gait with frequent falls since the time he started walking. He has certain impairment in speech also, which is very slow, and he takes quite long to complete words. He has some difficulty in holding spoon, pens, buttoning, unbuttoning also. He has some difficulty in holding on to slippers while walking. He also has a difficulty in writing. He writes very slow and writes in an unclear and big handwriting. He can attend to his own toilet needs, but requires help, especially in the mornings. He's a very fidgety, hyperactive, inattentive kind of child with certain sleep disturbances, like frequent arousals during the night. He goes to a normal school but has an average scholastic performance. And apart from the fact that he needs extra time for exams due to his slow writing, reading, and oral skills. The father also has noticed certain jerk-like body movements daily morning after waking up. One peculiar history we could find was a history of periodic fluctuations in the complaints, which were worse on awakening in the morning and used to get somewhat better after breakfast. And also there was an improvement of symptoms during the intercurrent illnesses. But there was no history suggestive of any failure to thrive, recurrent episodes of vomiting, any frank seizures, loss of consciousness, regression of intercurrent, any history of abnormal urine odor, any past history of fever with rash, or no history suggestive, and there was also no history suggestive of hearing or vision concerns. On examination, we saw that the child was an alert child, but fidgety. He was microcephalic. He walked with an ataxic gait, had intermittent bilateral ptosis, but rest of the cranial nerve examination was normal. He had a dysarthric speech. His tone was positive in him. He had very brisk deep tendon reflexes, but his plantar reflexes were flexor. His Romberg sign finger nose test were negative. He had some involuntary movements in the form of dyskinesia, dystonia, tic-like events. There was no organomegaly, and his vision and hearing were normal. So here we can see the video of the child. He's walking with somewhat wide-based, clumsy, unsteady gait. This is another video of the child where we are asking him to do certain postures, and we see that he is unable to maintain the postures, has some distal dyskinesia, dystonias, also has some facial dyskinesia, some tic-like movements. We see when he gets up, he has some again tic-like movements. I'm sorry. Another video where we are trying to check his facial movements. The facial movements are normal, but he has certain facial grimacing and tics. Again, a tic we saw. So after the history and examination, we came to a provisional diagnosis of a 9-year-old boy born of non-consanguineous marriage with a normal birth and family history, a delayed development, hyperreflexia, ataxia, a complex mixed hyperkinetic movement disorder, including dyskinesia, dystonia, and complex motor tics. The child had visited with these complaints to many centers, but no diagnosis were reached until now. These are the possibilities that we considered in this child. First is the structural causes like cerebellar or posterior fossa abnormalities, epileptic pseudoataxia, Inborn errors of metabolism like urea cycle defects, organic acidemias, glucose transporter defects, inherited mitochondrial disorders like Golgi associated disorders, vitamin and cofactor responsive disorders like vitamin E dependent disorders, neurotransmitter disorders, other rare genetic disorders like ADCY5 related dyskinesia or spinocerebellar ataxias, certain primary dystonia syndromes like DOPA responsive dystonias. But one point against this is there is no worsening of the symptoms as the day progresses. Rather, the symptoms are worse in the morning. So we went ahead with the investigations and found that the MRI brain was normal, which ruled out the structural causes. We did the EEG, which was again normal, which ruled out epileptic pseudoataxia. We went further with the metabolic workup, which was ammonia, lactate, homocysteine, TMS, urine GCMS were normal, and ruled out inborn errors of metabolism like urea cycle defects and organic acidemias. His nerve conduction studies and mitochondrial gene panel were also normal, which ruled out inherited mitochondrial disorders. So the evaluation which we had until now was a normal fundus, metabolic workup, EEG, nerve conduction studies, MRI brain, and a mitochondrial gene panel. And the remaining possibilities from our list were inborn errors of metabolism like glucose transporter defects, vitamin and cofactor responsive disorders, neurotransmitter disorders, and other rare genetic disorders like ADCY5 related dyskinesia and spinocerebellar ataxias. So we planned a lumbar puncture for a CSF study, but the CSF study could not be done due to COVID-19 hospitalization restrictions. So we went ahead with the next generation sequencing directly and found a pathogenic variant in SLC2A1 gene, which was heterozygous and has an autosomal dominant inheritance, and results in diseases like dystonia 9 and GLUT1 deficiency syndrome 2. We also did Sanger sequencing validation for the reported variant, and also parent studies were done. Both the parents were asymptomatic and did not have any variation detected in their samples. So this indicates that the likely pathogenic variation detected in the index patient is a de novo variant. So now a final diagnosis remains as inborn errors of metabolism, that is the GLUT1 deficiency syndrome, also known as de Vivos disease, presenting as isolated complex movement disorder. Reviewing the literature of GLUT1 transporter defects, there are several glucose transporters that have been identified in various tissues. GLUT1 is mainly found in brain, kidney, placenta, and RBC, and is responsible for the uptake of glucose. This is a pictorial representation of all the transporters present on the cell membrane. And here we can see the GLUT transporter, that is a glucose transporter 1, which helps in the transport of glucose from the bloodstream to the central nervous tissue, and it is encoded by SLC2A1 gene. A defect in this gene could result in a defective transport protein and therefore a defective glucose transport across the membrane, resulting in glucose deficiency in the CNS and thus in the CNS manifestations. GLUT1 deficiency syndrome is inherited as an autosomal dominant disorder because of the heterozygous pathogenic variants in SLC2A1 gene. The phenotypic spectrum of glucose transporter defect syndrome includes a classic phenotype of developmental encephalopathy, which has epilepsy, cognitive behavioral disturbances, and movement disorders, or it can also present alone as epilepsy, like infantile and absent seizures, or movement disorders like spasticity, ataxia, dystonia, chorea, and also alone with cognitive or behavioral disturbances like in cognitive impairment, delayed adaptive behavior, and a variable attention span. Ataxia and ataxia plus spastic gait is the most common movement disorder reported by a recent review done by Silver G et al. In 2020. And ataxia has reported to improve after feeding in some patients. The characteristic biomarker for diagnosis of this disorder is low CSF glucose, that is less than 60 milligram per deciliter, or low CSF to blood glucose ratio, that is less than 0.4 in the presence of a normal blood glucose. MRI brain is usually normal in these situations, and confirmation of the diagnosis requires next generation sequencing or direct Sanger sequencing of SLC2A1 gene when the CSF glucose is indicative. GLUT1 deficiency syndrome is one of the few metabolic disorders with treatment available. The treatment mainstay is ketogenic diet, which is a high-fat, low-carbohydrate, normocaloric diet, which provides ketone bodies as an alternative fuel for the brain via the monocarboxylic transporter 1 in the brain, which we can see here. So when the child is on ketogenic diet, ketone body levels should be monitored, and it is recommended that beta hydroxybutyrate levels should be kept at 4 to 5 millimoles. It is also reported in the literature that the response to treatment varies depending on the age of diagnosis and application of the ketogenic diet, which makes early diagnosis of this disorder and start of ketogenic diet all the more important. There are certain drugs that should be avoided in such cases. First, the drugs that inhibit the function of glucose transporter 1, like phenobarbital and caffeine. And the other, the drugs that can interfere with the ketogenic diet, like sodium valproate, topiramate, zonisamide, and acetazolamide. So the parents were counseled about the nature of the disease. He was advised certain lifestyle measures and given the list of drugs that should be avoided in the patient. The child has been started on ketogenic diet on teleconsultation only because the child could not visit the clinic. And currently he's on classical ketogenic diet with a regular monitoring of metabolic parameters. We would like to emphasize through this that GLUT1 deficiency can present with isolated complex movement disorders without epilepsy in children. And it is imperative to diagnose such rare treatable causes early, as the early initiation of ketogenic diet can have an impact on the prognosis of the child. These are my references. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepthi. A nice presentation. And again, we thank Srihar Neurology team for enlightening us the new point. That is, we all know that it often presents as infantile seizures, not responding to any anticonvulsant, but presenting in the late manner, that too with movement disorder, is new to us. Thank you so much, Deepthi and Dr. Ranjit. And we will go to our third case from Department of Neurology, Rainbow Children Hospital, from Dr. Padma. Over to you, Dr. Padma Balaji. The stage is yours. Okay, go for slideshow and you can start your presentation. Dr. Satya.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, audible. Proceed.
Good afternoon. I myself, Dr. Satya, Registrar, and I'm doing this presentation under Dr. Padma Balaji, ma'am, Pediatric Neurology in Rainbow Children Hospital. I'm going to present about a rare case of hyponatremia. One minute, sir. As we all know, anti-epileptic drugs are known to cause a variety of adverse reactions, varying from sinister such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome, example, to nuisance such as drowsiness, lethargy. So hyponatremia is known to occur with some of the AED, as we all know. However, symptomatic hyponatremia is not much common. So our aim of this presentation is to emphasize drugs as a cause of symptomatic hyponatremia, history and risk factor, and to highlight the type of adverse reaction with the AED and implication in management. Excuse me, sir. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, please proceed.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Coming to K1, she's a 8-year-old female child. She's preterm by 34 weeks and birth weight was 1.25 kg. She had admitted with intraventricular hemorrhage, sepsis and thrombocytopenia in newborn period. She's basically a developmental delay and a known case of seizure disorder. She was on multiple anti-epileptic drugs such as oxcarbazepine, lamotrigine and levetiracetam. So developmentally, at present, she can walk when held, with support, and still now she can care her needs. Seizure wise, she had first febrile seizure at 11 months. She was not started on any antiepileptic. Then she had afebrile seizure since March 2018. She was initially started on oxcarbazepine. Then August 2019, she was started on Levipil and clofazam. Then November 2019, she had a typical GTCS type of seizure. Then on Jan 2020, she was started on lamotrigine in view of nocturnal jerk. So she underwent multiple EEG, which were showing abnormal changes in EEG. And last one was December 2020, which showed right frontal focal epileptiform discharge suggestive of ES. And MRI brain showed porencephalic cyst and also gliosis. She was admitted in December 2020 elsewhere with vomiting, where hyponatremia was noticed, and she was treated with supportive measures such as IV fluid, and she was discharged as acute gastritis. Again, she got admitted here with vomiting. This time lethargy was so significant. She was very drowsy, and there was no history of a fever, loose stool. However, his urine output was normal. She was very drowsy on examination. She was not but she responded well to comments. There was no significant dehydration. Her BP was in normal limit. There was no focal deficit. Her serum sensorium at serum sodium is 123, but her blood count, hematocrit, urea, creat, albumin, sugar, potassium, and bicarb, everything was in normal limit. So this is the present admission. Her sodium is 123. Bicarb was normal. This was on December 2020 during her first admission. That time sodium was 123. During second admission, her serum osmolarity is 263. That is on lower range of normal, and urine osmolarity is slightly elevated. It's suggestive of SAADH. Currently, we have a child with 2 subsequent admission in the past with similar symptoms, that's vomiting, and each time she was noticed to have hyponatremia. So although she had hyponatremia and vomiting, we initially thought of whether this vomiting could cause this hyponatremia, but there was no significant vomiting. It was only 1 to 2 episodes. Clinically also, she was there was no dehydration. So when we look back, she had a sodium of 123. So this vomiting could be due to the symptomatic hyponatremia. While we went back to the history, she was started on multiple anti-epileptic drug, but during that December episode, her oxcarbazepine dose was escalated to 37 mg per kg per day from 25 mg per kg per day. As we all know, hyponatremia is due to oxcarbazepine. So let's see briefly about this. Basically, this hyponatremia due to oxcarbazepine due to dose-related side effect. It's most commonly seen in first 3 months of therapy and later with the dose escalation. They are usually asymptomatic but can cause symptoms when sodium level is less than 125. There was one study, it showed among 97 people treated with oxcarbazepine, incidence of serum sodium less than 134 was 29.9%, which is being increasing with increasing age. Mechanism is, as we all know, SAADH. Basically, dose-related side effect is they tend to appear early in the course of the therapy. Some disappear over time. It can be minimized by slow titration, as in this case, hyponatremia due to oxcarbazepine. There are other other adverse effect due to AEDs, that is idiosyncratic reaction, that is drug rash commonly due to carbamazepine. They appear within days to weeks of initiation of therapy, but they regress after withdrawal of offending agent. Other examples are hepatotoxicity due to valproate and pancreatitis due to valproate. And other adverse effect of AEDs are a chronic side effect. They used to develop insidiously and may become apparent only after months or even years of therapy, such as seen in valproate, weight gain in valproate and weight loss in topiramate. So coming to the present case, On 29th, sodium was 123. So we thought of SADH due to oxcarbazepine. Here we stopped, we decreased the dose of oxcarbazepine to the old dose. So on 3rd, her sodium was 131. Again on 12th, her sodium was 131. It remains normal after that. So what are the lessons we learned here? So vomiting, it could be the manifestation of multiple cause from AGE to raised ICP. So history taking gives an important clue here. Even though background history of neurological disorder is there, if the child is present with the SADH, we should think of drug also in the back of our mind. Unlike Stevens-Johnson syndrome and DRESS, reduction of dose often helps in reversing the hyponatremia. So rationalization of the AED polypharmacy and minimize the drug whenever is appropriate. So although it looks simple, like this hyponatremia due to oxcarbazepine, as we all know, with this background history, it was difficult at the time. The baby was having a underlying neurological issue, and there was some dehydration. Sorry, as there was some vomiting history. Coming to second case, he is a male child, preterm by 36 weeks. Seizure on day 6 of life, treated with a Levipil outside, and he had a IVH grade 3 bilateral, referred here on day 10 of life for increasing ventricular size. He also had sepsis, shock, and his blood culture showed serratia, and received IV antibiotic and other supportive medication. Initially, he underwent an Ommaya reservoir, followed by he underwent VP shunt on day 48 of life. His feed was slowly started from OG to direct breastfeeding. Also, his other parameters were normal. He had persistent hyponatremia. This table shows that sodium level were between 120 to 125, almost all the finding, till 412. So till 412, he was on Levipil. He was started on Levipil for seizure. As he didn't develop any seizure, it was stopped on 27th. His repeated value on 4th and 12th became normal. Again, he underwent VP shunt on 12th. Followed by he developed a seizure. So he was restarted on Levipil. Again, his sodium became started to decreasing. So at examination, his weight was 3.24 kg. There was no edema. He was feeding well, active child. His urine output was adequate. His sugar was normal. Cortisol was normal. Thyroid function was normal. However, his urine sodium was elevated, that is 120, and his urine osmolarity was slightly on higher side, and his serum osmolarity slightly on lower side. And his ultrasound cranium showed retracting clot with a decreasing size of ventricle. And he was only on Levipil at the time on 40 mg per kg per day. So he's overall improving clinically. His neurological status and his overall activity is also improving to near normal. Still, he had persistent persistent low sodium. So what else could be? So we thought whether this Levipil could have caused this hyponatremia. So as we all know, Levipil is a very good drug. It has good safety profile, and as most common side effect as we see is behavioral and neuropsychiatry symptoms. But we went through literature. There was few studies which quotes Levipil can cause hyponatremia due to SADH, but most of the studies were done in adults only. Only one newborn study. Hello. Only one newborn study we got. So in that they included 18 full-term unit with HIE, IVH, brain malformation, and stroke. They did one study of pharmacokinetic of IV Levipil in neonate. It showed marked changes in pharmacokinetic occurred during first week of life. In that one newborn had treatment emergent hyponatremia. This infant, this newborn is actually critically ill with HIE, and he was receiving hypothermia with other supportive medication. So we again thought of whether it could be Levipil induced. So we stopped Levipil on 24/12. His sodium was rechecked again on 26th. It was 134. His serial monitoring, then it was it became normal. So like our study, like in our child, Nastrale et al. Did one study in adult. In that, they found a strong temporal association was seen between introduction and discontinuation of Levipil and the worsening of hyponatremia in this patient, thought to be due to SAADH. So its pharmacodynamic explain that of hyponatremia increase of the sport level in 1 to 2 days after its discontinuation. So what are the lessons we learned here is, although we cannot establish a causal relationship between levetiracetam and hyponatremia with the present literature, literature search for a side effect for a drug more than likely to find one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stop sharing. Stop sharing. And we request our next presenter, Dr. Edison, from Department of Pediatrics.
Yes, sir.
This is a case child student. Padma, please stop sharing. Thank you.
So shall I start, sir?
Edison, please.
I'm Edison from Kanchi Kamakoti Child Trust Hospital, presenting an interesting cause of hypocellular mass. So you're able to see, no, sir? I've shared one minute.
To see the slides. No.
Requesting our presenters to subscribe to the cameras.
Are you able to see, sir?
Yeah.
Okay.
Slideshow.
Presenting an interesting case of hypocellular marrow. My consultant is Dr. T. Ravi Kumar, and I'm being moderated by Dr. Deena Dayalan and Dr. Meena Shankaran, pediatric hematologist. Presenting a 5-year and 11-month-old child presented with progressive pallor for 1 month duration, with decreased appetite for 2 weeks and decreased activity and lethargy for 1 week duration. The child was born to third-degree consanguineously married couple. The child has an younger sibling who was apparently normal. On examination, the child had no gross dysmorphism, had pallor, multiple petechiae and bilateral upper limb, lower limbs were present. Systemic examination, cardiac-wise, the child was not in failure. RS, bilateral air entry was equal, no added sounds. Peripheral examination revealed a 2 centimeter soft liver palpable below right costal margin with no splenomegaly on systemic examination. The child's initial labs showed hemoglobin of 4.1 gram per deciliter with total count of 7,400 with neutrophils of 9 and lymphocytes of 85. The ANC turned out to be 666 and platelet count was less than 10,000. The child had cytopenia with neutropenia in the initial CBC evaluation, and the MCV was high with 109, with reticulocyte count was 3%, with the corrected reticulocyte count was 1%, and the immature platelet fraction done on the child was 1.8%, which was normal. Peripheral smear examination revealed reactive lymphocytes, no blasts or macrocytes were present, no hypersegmented neutrophils on the peripheral smear. So we went ahead for evaluation of pancytopenia in a baby. We ruled out infection by a negative HIV, HBsAg, and anti-HCV. And immunological causes of pancytopenia was ruled out by negative DCT and a negative ANA. and malignancy was ruled out by the peripheral smear didn't reveal any blast, and the TLS workup was normal in the child. And nutritional causes of pancytopenia was ruled out by a normal vitamin B12 and folic acid level. And other causes we suspected were
clear. Maybe I am not sure about my connection. The slides.
Other causes we considered were inherited bone marrow failure syndromes and myelodysplastic syndromes in the child. But so we proceeded with the bone marrow examination. The bone marrow aspiration revealed an aparticulate bone marrow with normal erythropoiesis and myelopoiesis, no megakaryocytes in the peripheral smear, the smear identified, smear studied, and no abnormal cells. But the bone marrow biopsy showed a hypocellular bone marrow with 10% cellularity with 90% fat, suggestive of aplastic anemia. Bone marrow cytogenetics, though it was normal, ruling out by myelodysplastic syndromes. The possibilities considered at this point of time were a transient bone marrow suppression, possible secondary to infection, or an acute aplastic anemia, or inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. So as the initial management for anemia and thrombocytopenia, the child received PRBC transfusion and platelet transfusion. And on multiple occasions on follow-up, in view of persisting anemia and thrombocytopenia, the child had received multiple transfusions. And suspecting an infectious cause for bone marrow suppression, a trial of IV immunoglobulin was given, but there was no response. There was no response in improvement in counts in the child. So as an evaluation for an hypocellular bone marrow, a child with pancytopenia, we first did a bone marrow biopsy, which we were able to exclude myelodysplastic syndromes, leukemia, and other cancers which leading to bone marrow hyperplasia. The bone marrow aspirate in the child sent for cytogenetics did not reveal any chromosomal abnormalities, or cytology did not confirm any blasts. The peripheral smear, so as a genetic, to rule out genetic causes, we did a Fanconi screen by a chromosomal breakage analysis test. It turned out to be negative in our child. The ANC determined in our child was 666. Acquired, so the possibilities considered were acquired aplastic anemia at this point of time. We proceeded with an HLA matched family DOMAS screening, but we couldn't get an HLA matched donor in the family. So our next choice of treatment was so ATG with cyclosporin administration for marrow suppression. As American Society of Hematology recommends bone marrow transplantation only if an sibling donor with a matched HLA sibling donor is available. So on a serial follow-up, the child had hemoglobin of 4. For at admission it was 4.1, and on multiple transfusions, the child had received multiple transfusions with thus thereby maintaining hemoglobin. The ANC was persistently low in our baby on follow-up, and the platelets were persistently less than 10,000 on follow-up even after multiple transfusions. So we thought of role of genetics in our child as when we went through the literature. Hypocellular bone marrow failure is characterized by a hypocellular for age marrow and encompasses a diverse group of inherited and acquired disorders for which diagnosis is complicated by substantial overlap in clinical presentation. Genetic testing by next generation sequencing may in this context enable the identification of patients expressing clonal changes or genetic predispositions. Next generation sequencing has high predictive value for the identification of patients who already have or also prone to myeloid malignancy in a situation of aplastic anemia. So we went ahead with a clinical exome sequencing in our child. It was we got the report as an autosomal dominant, THPO gene mutation, which was reported as an autosomal dominant inheritance, which was homozygous mutation. The disease mentioned in our report was thrombocytopenia based on previous literature. See, we went ahead with the parental screening for the baby of the baby, and we identified heterozygous mutations of same gene, THPO gene, in both the parents, though both the parents were asymptomatic. So when we went through the literature, so THPO is a mutation of THPO mutation. THPO is expressed mainly in hepatocytes, renal convoluted tubules, bone marrow, stromal cells in spleen, and in few other regions such as amygdala and hippocampus in the central nervous system. The interaction of THPO with its receptor is largely responsible for megakaryocytosis and related activation, as well as hematopoietic stem cells. So thereby the deficiency of thrombopoietin mutation and THPO mutation, thereby leading to thrombopoietin deficiency, has led to thrombocytopenia and anemia. Also, it is as it is also responsible for maintenance of hematopoietic stem cells. So the THPO gene has two regions. One is the THPO main gene, and the other other region is 5-UTR region. Any mutation in 5-UTR gene region may lead to thrombocytosis. Any mutation in the coding regions of the gene will lead to thrombocytopenia. So the THPO mimetics might serve as a potential therapy in our patient. So romiplastim, based on literature, romiplastim and eltrombog are FDA approved THPO mimetics used in treatment of patients with idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura. So based on literature review and genetic analysis, we started our trial on romiplastim 5 mics per kg. The usual dose is around 1 to 10 mics per kg. It's a platelet response adaptive dosing. We had a target platelet count in our child of more than 50,000 to prevent bleeding manifestations. So the dose was titrated based on follow-up platelet levels in the child. So the child had maximum required dose of 10 mics per kg. Now currently the child is on 5 mics per kg. On follow-up on romiplastim, the child's serial platelet counts improved with improving anemia. The child didn't require any further platelet or PRBC transfusions after that, with an improving ANC on follow-up. So, so we had a dilemma of lifelong romiplastim versus a bone marrow transplantation. But the side effects of lifelong romiplastim includes headache and fatigue and epistaxis, arthralgia, thrombotic events that have been reported. But again, there is also a possibility of this aplastic anemia getting manifesting as a myelodysplastic syndrome in a later age. So as of now, in the event of COVID situation and the need for parents to arrange money for bone marrow transplantation, we have using romiplastim as a bridging therapy prior to bone marrow transplantation as a definitive treatment in our child. So conclusion, next generation sequencing results may potentially lead to individually tailored treatment regimens based on specific mutational patterns rather than a given hematological diagnosis alone. Next generation sequencing testing cannot stand alone as a diagnostic tool, but should rather be incorporated into a diagnostic algorithm to guide in direction of correct diagnosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Edison. Thanks a lot. Again, we are more into genetics. Thank you. Right, our next case is look beyond the kidney. A case of RPGN. Presenter Dr. Abhirami from Department of Nephrology, Apollo Children's Hospital unit, belongs to Dr. Saravanan. Edison, stop sharing. Abhirami, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Abhirami, DNB resident, Apollo Children's Hospital. I'm presenting this case under Dr. Madhubandhu Saravanan, consultant nephrologist, Apollo Children's Hospital. This is a 15-year-old adolescent boy, firstborn of non-consanguineous married parents from West Bengal. He presented with fever, which was low grade and intermittent for 2 weeks, along cola-colored urine for 5 days, reduced urine output, swelling of both legs, cough for 3 days, and anuria for almost 12 hours. So, for his fever, he was initially treated at his hometown with antipyretics and antibiotics. However, his fever persisted, and also he developed hematuria, oliguria, and edema of both the legs. History-wise, he didn't have any joint pain or swelling, jaundice, or hemoptysis. He was investigated with basic blood and urine investigations and was brought here for further management. His past history is insignificant, no previous hospital admission or no history of renal disorders or chronic illness in family members. On examination, he was lethargic, febrile, anemic, facial puffiness is present, bilateral pitting pedal edema was present, no icterus, no rash or oral ulcers. Anthropometry was appropriate for this age. Vitals were appropriate with BP falling on the 19th centile. Systemic examination showed mildly distended abdomen with no organomegaly or tenderness. Other systems were found to be normal. So this is a 15-year-old boy with hematuria, edema, reduced urine output which progressed to anuria. And South Sea renal function also showed a raised creatinine with deranged electrolytes. So this is a case of RPGN, possibly due to vasculitis syndromes, SLE, the PSGN, although this is age group is not common, and IgA nephropathy and HUS. So we proceeded with the following investigations. The initial investigation showed a hemoglobin of 7.7. They raised ESR, severely deranged renal function of urea 210, creatinine was 8.7, sodium of 101, potassium of 5.7. And his urine routine also showed plenty of RBCs along with subnephrotic range proteinuria. So urine spot PCR showed 3.7. So this clinical picture and lab reports confirmed RPGN. So we proceeded with the vasculitis workup. Incidentally, we did an X-ray and found bilateral lung infiltrates. So initially we thought during this COVID pandemic whether this could be COVID. However, he was stable and did not show any signs of respiratory distress and saturating well in room air. And COVID RT-PCR also turned out to be negative. Other investigations for his fever also was found to be blood and urine culture was negative. The HIV, HBV, HCV serology were also found to be negative. We proceeded with the CT chest, which showed bilateral lung infiltrates with a few of the nodules with a few nodules showing cavitation. So the probable pulmonary renal syndromes were considered. Our diagnosis narrowed down to granulomatosis polyangiitis, microscopic polyangiitis, anti-GBM disease or SLE. Eventually, the vasculitis panel also came out. The C-ANCA found to be positive. The other investigation, other markers like ANA, anti-dsDNA, anti-GBM antibody were found to be negative. C3, C4 levels were normal. ASO were also normal. That rules out SLE and PSGN. And echo was found to be normal. Ultrasound abdomen showed grade 2 medical renal disease. So the diagnosis is with a clinical picture of RPGN, pulmonary involvement of seen on chest X-ray and CT chest, and with C-ANCA being positive, we made a diagnosis of granulomatosis with polyangiitis, and he received the following treatment: hemodialysis along with plasma exchange for 7 cycles, injection cyclophosphamide 1 dose along with methylprednisolone 1 gram IV followed by oral, and he also received rituximab single dose. On discharge, he had mild pallor, his edema settled well, and urine output was approximately 250 ml per day. His blood investigations showed a hemoglobin of 9.1. However, his urea creatinine was still deranged. Electrolytes are a bit normal compared to the admission values. Chest X-ray showed clearance after immunosuppressant therapy. He is on follow-up. He is at his hometown with receiving regular hemodialysis. His urine output is approximately 500 ml per day. Recently, after discharge from hospital, he had COVID infection and category A, and he was recovered with conservative management. He was planned for rituximab second dose and planned for a renal biopsy later. So small discussion about granulomatosis polyangiitis. It is also known as regionous granulomatosis. It is a small vessel vasculitis associated with ANCA antibodies positive, and the granulomatous inflammation on histology with the pauci-immune necrotizing inflammation. So other ANCA-associated vasculitis are microscopic polyangiitis, eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, Strauss syndrome. This is a common presentation in adults. However, in pediatric age group, the mean age of presentation is around 14 years. Girls seems to be affected more than boys. The pathogenesis is ANCA. Presence of ANCA activates the neutrophils and monocytes. Causes release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. It leads to inflammatory vessels accumulation in the endothelium, leading to vascular damage. The clinical features include constitutional. The renal involvement is more common, around 83%, followed by lower airway, with cranial or peripheral nerve involvement being the least common presentation. The complications of this disease includes pulmonary hemorrhage, which can be dreadful. Subglottic stenosis can be present, along with saddle nose deformity due to persistent nasal ulceration. The criteria, there are several criteria for diagnosis. The commonest one is European League Against rheumatism criteria. Among these 6 criteria, if 3 of the criteria are present, a diagnosis of GPA can be made. Upper airway involvement like recurrent sinusitis, serous otitis media, nasal discharge, epistaxis, laryngotracheobronchial involvement like subglottic stenosis, pulmonary involvement is seen in X-ray or CT, histopathology from the upper airway or lower airway showing granulomatous inflammation, CNCO positivity, or a renal involvement in the form of proteinuria, hematuria, or hypertension, or crescent formation in renal biopsy. In this child, we had pulmonary involvement seen on CT, with the CNCO being positivity and renal involvement in the form of severe hematuria and rapidly deteriorating renal function. So we made a diagnosis and we proceeded with the treatment. So the differential diagnosis are the commonest differential diagnosis granulomatosis with polyangiitis or Church-Strauss and microscopic. However, this is characterized by proteinase 3 or CNCO positivity. The other two, Church-Strauss and microscopic polyangiitis, characterized by PNCO positivity. And the history of asthma is commonly seen with Church-Strauss or eosinophilic granulomatous polyangiitis. The laboratory investigations show these are non-specific. However, CBC shows anemia, leukocytosis, thrombocytosis, elevated ESR and CRP, CNCO being positive, autoimmune necrotizing granulomatous lesion on biopsy. Treatment, the induction phase, the current there are no definite protocols for treatment of vaginous granulomatosis in pediatric population. These are extrapolated from the adult population only. The current treatment regimens used are oral, either IV or oral methylprednisolone along with cyclophosphamide. However, rituximab is gaining popularity as induction in induction treatment. But once remission is attained, the patient can be started on maintenance therapy with methotrexate, azathioprine, or mycophenolate mofetil. Plasmapheresis, it has a role reduced in dialysis dependency in patients with severe renal involvement. These articles shows that the current intensive B-cell depletion therapy along with IV cyclophosphamide and rituximab, it in patients with severe renal involvement shows rapid remission and also hemodialysis, early weaning from dialysis. These trials shows that RAVE and rituximab trials are the RCTs which are studies the efficacy of rituximab in induction therapy in patients. This shows that rituximab is superior, is significant in patients with relapsing disease. However, it is also non-inferior compared to cyclophosphamide in a patient newly diagnosed patient. The PEXIVAS trial is a study which shows the importance of which studies the efficacy of plasma exchange in a patient presenting with CNCO associated vasculitis. It shows it can be used in a patient who presented with severe pulmonary hemorrhage at disease onset or with severe renal involvement. The long-term prognosis in this disease are the disease-associated complications are progression to end-stage renal disease, pulmonary hemorrhage, saddle nose deformity, uveitis, hearing loss. The treatment-associated complications include on prolonged immunosuppression, it leads to infection, sepsis, growth retardation, cataract, glaucoma associated with steroid, and infertility associated with the cyclophosphamide. So the take-home message is, in this child, when I did a chest X-ray, the first possible diagnosis, whether it could be due to COVID or other COVID-related sequelae. However, we should be kept. The thing we should keep in mind is, even in the pandemic, we should look beyond COVID, and our mindset should be broad to think about other systemic involvement. And this disease is a rare presentation in pediatric population. There are no definite treatment protocols for pediatric population, and there are several studies which are under trials, and newer treatment protocols are emerging. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, doctor. This is the first time we have been seeing a case of granulomatosis with polyangiitis presentation in our forum, to my knowledge. Sorry if I am wrong. Thanks a lot. And you have some questions you need to answer at the end of the session.
Okay.
And the next, you can stop sharing. And the next is from the Department of PICU from Dr. Elarsi ma'am and Puvarigi madam. Presenter Dr. Nisha. Unusual cardiac manifestation of Missy. Missy is back again, it seems. Okay, over to you, Nisha.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Audible, visible, proceed.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, all. Myself, Dr. Nisha, Fellow in Pediatric Intensive Care at ICH. I'm here to give a presentation on an unusual cardiac manifestation in MISC. Sorry, sir. We had a 12 years female, firstborn of non-consanguineous marriage, came to us with complaints of fever for 4 days, abdomen pain for 2 days, vomiting for 2 days, and loose stool 1 day. So this was her assessment when we received her in the room. Her airway was stable. She had an effortless tachypnea, saturation of 100% with oxygen through NRM. She was tachycardic. She had cool peripheries with distal peripheral pulses. CRT was prolonged, liver span was normal, BP was 60/40, which was less than 5th percentile for her age. And she was awake, obeying commands. Eyes were in mid position, no lid twitch or nystagmus. Her extraocular movements were full. And her sugar and temperature at presentation were normal. Other system examination, cardiovascular system, S1, S2 heart, no murmur. RS, bilateral air entry was equal and clear. Her abdomen was soft, no organomegaly. And tone is equal in all 4 limbs, no focal deficit. Head to foot examination revealed bilateral conjunctival suffusion and right subconjunctival hemorrhage was present. So in view of the hypotensive shock, she was resuscitated with a fluid bolus of 60 ml per kg. And in view of refractory hypotensive shock, she was started on, it was a fluid refractory shock. So she was started on inotropes and intubated. Shock got corrected with epinephrine infusion of 0.4 mics per kg per minute, and she was shifted to PICU. So in PICU, her blood reports revealed an elevated total count with polymorph predominance. Her hemoglobin was 9.2 grams per deciliter, platelets normal, ESR elevated, CRP was positive, urea and creatinine were elevated, liver enzymes were within normal limits, prothrombin time, APTT, INR slightly elevated, and urine routine showed albumin of 3+ and 10 to 15 pus cells. Chest X-ray was normal, and we proceeded with the COVID RT-PCR, which was negative. So with this presentation and blood reports, our provisional diagnosis was septic shock, query MISC. So we did an echo, which showed a mild LV dysfunction with an EF of 51% and FS of 21%. And coronary artery measurements revealed an LMC of 3 millimeter with a Z score of -0.8, RCA 3.9 millimeters with Z scores of +2.54, which is dilated, and LAD measuring 2 millimeters with Z score of -0.75. And she had a mild pericardial effusion too. So we then did a D-dimer. The levels were 6.65 micrograms per ml, which is elevated. And hence we did an IgG COVID, which was positive with a titer of 83.77. Urine and blood cultures showed no growth. So with this, we had a diagnosis of MISC. So by day 2 of admission, we have started her on IVIG at a dose of 2 grams per kg and methylprednisolone. So treatment was going on. And by day 3, she had a fall in sensorium. And her bedside fundus examination revealed right side fundal bleeds. So we actually wanted to do a CT brain at that point, but we couldn't shift her in view of refractory hypotensive shock with multiple inotropes and ventilatory support. And she continued to have fever spikes too. Her blood count, serial blood counts showed a falling trend of total counts, hemoglobin and platelet. So we did a bone marrow aspiration, which was suggestive of hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis when she was already on steroids. And we escalated her antibiotics. Still fever spikes were persisting, which came down by day 9. By day 10, we did a repeat echo, which showed thrombi in the left ventricle. We were able to localize 2 thrombi, one at the apex measuring 2 × 1.5 centimeter, and another one along interventricular septum measuring 0.5 × 1.1 centimeter, as you could see in the picture. The clots along the interventricular septum is it's visible in this picture. On the right side, you could see the clot, and the picture on the left side shows the measurement. So as per cardiologist opinion, at this point, we have started low molecular weight heparin. So at this point, the child was on antibiotics, low molecular weight heparin, aspirin, steroids, and inotrope support. By day 13, we were able to stop her inotrope support. But by day 14, on neurological examination, she had developed right hemiparesis. So we shifted her for a CT brain, which revealed an infarct involving the left frontoparietal region, as shown in this neuroimaging. So we called the neurologist for their opinion. So she was then started on unfractionated heparin, initially at with a bolus dose of 75 units per kg, followed by 20 units per kg per hour infusion was started for her with APTT monitoring. After all these, by day 20, we were able to extubate the child. The next day after extubation, she was still continued on heparin infusion at the same dose, 20 units per kg per hour. And we have also added her on tablet azithromycin at a dose of 0.2 milligrams per kg with a target INR of 1.5 to 2.5. By day 24, her serial monitoring showed a prolonged APTT. So we had to stop her heparin infusion, and we had continued only on azithromycin and aspirin. Repeat echo on day 27 actually showed a reduction in the size of the clots, and EF was good. So we planned to shift her to the ward with azithromycin under INR monitoring, aspirin, and oral steroids. In the ward, the child's stable was the child's vital signs were stable. By day 36, she again developed fever spikes. So septic workup were repeated and antibiotics were restarted in the ward. And in her neurologist, as per the neurologist review, her thrombotic workup were actually planned. So protein C, S, antithrombin activity, lipoprotein A were all planned, but we couldn't do at that point because the next day the child deteriorated in the form of a melena, and her INR was prolonged. So her anticoagulants were stopped. Child then clinically became pale. She developed shock and had seizures in the ward. So her ABCD were stabilized with intubation, fluid boluses, blood products for the bleeds, and AED for seizures. She was given injection vitamin K also, and then shifted back to PICU. So we then had a repeat neuroimaging for her, which revealed subacute infarct of left frontoparietal region with hemorrhagic transformations, as you're able to see in this picture. So in PICU, she was treated, she was there with us for a period of about 48 hours. Despite all the effort, the child had a refractory shock and succumbed to sepsis and refractory ICP. So this case was quite challenging for us in view of the unusual cardiac manifestation. That is, cardiac thrombi was new for us in MISC. And so far as in pediatrics, the common cardiac manifestations in MISC that we have seen were cardiogenic shock, arrhythmias, pericardial effusion, and coronary artery dilation. Biochemical markers of inflammation will be raised in these children. And we have seen PCR positivity in around 33% of these patients. IgM, IgG antibodies together positivity seen in around 15.7, and IgG positivity alone seen in around 45%. So as we all know, the consistently elevated levels of D-dimers has emerged as an independent risk factor for poor outcome. The pathophysiology underlying hypercoagulable state is poorly understood. A severe inflammatory response originating in alveoli triggers a dysfunctional cascade of thrombosis in pulmonary vasculature, leading to the local coagulopathy. In severe patients, this is followed by a generalized hypercoagulable state that results in micro and macrovascular thrombosis. Intracardiac thrombi in MISC has not been reported so far. Otherwise, apart from MISC, intracardiac thrombi in children has an overall mortality of around 39%, and embolic events has been seen in around 13 to 15%, and 63% of them would resolve with medical therapy alone, and only a very few would require a surgical thrombectomy. So this case was quite challenging for us because we have had almost more than 150 cases of MISC in our institute, but intracardiac thrombi, this is the first case we saw. And we had so many challenges in her management because she had her initial EF was around 51%, but over a period of time, she had a fall in EF, and we had a least value of around EF of around 33% also was once documented. But we couldn't start her on low molecular weight heparin at that point also, because clinically we found a fundal bleed, which was confirmed by an ophthalmologist also. But once we found a frank thrombi in the left ventricle, we were able to start we started her on low molecular weight heparins, but within 4 days, she had an embolic event in the form of stroke. So this was very unusual and challenging for us, and that is why we wanted to present it here today. Thank you all. These are my references. Thanks to our director, Professor Edilarsi ma'am, for this opportunity. Our thanks to cardiologists and neurologists for their guidance in this management. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And the next from Stanley by Mr. Dr. Jebin. Okay. So over to you, Jebin. And this is a case of a spasm not due to shadows. From Dr. Vinod, Professor, Ganesh Unit, Stanley Medical College.
Good afternoon, sir. I am audible.
Audible, visible, proceed.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Gavin Frederick from Stanley Medical College, postgraduate. I am going to present a spasm not due to shadows. I first thank our director, Dr. Ganesh sir, and my moderator, Dr. Vinod sir. A 10-year-old male child of non-consanguineous marriage came with chief complaints of posturing of both upper limb and lower limb. The child was brought to our room and had posturing in the form of corpopedal spasm, lasted for the past 2 days. Tingling sensation and myalgia was present in both upper limbs. Child was responding to oral comments. He had similar episode 2 years back. On negative history, there was no history of yellowish discoloration of eyes, abdominal pain, high colored urine, pale colored stools, suggestive of obstructive cholestatic jaundice. No history of frequent diarrheal episodes, steatorrhea, suggestive of malabsorption, and there was no history of pallor, reduced urine output, polyuria, hematuria, and urinary tract infection, suggestive of CKD, RTA, and Fanconi. There was no history of any anticonvulsant steroid intake, which increases the metabolism of vitamin D. There was no history of a recurrent infection, congenital cardiac anomalies, suggestive of congenital hypoparathyroidism, and there was no history of surgical procedures, radiation exposure, recurrent blood transfusion, suggestive of acute hypoparathyroidism, and there was no history of allergy to milk products, excessive intake of grainy leaf vegetables and grains. His newborn period was uneventful. There was no neonatal seizures and history of inadequate due to COVID was present. And what is adequate exposure? It is exposure to direct sunlight for more than 2 hours for 2 days in a week from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., exposing at least 30% of the body surface area. No family history of rickets or unexplained short stature in family members, no psychological disturbance in child, and there was no history of delayed eruption of teeth and delayed milestones. On examination, the child is well built, no pallor, no clubbing, no icterus, no generalized lymphadenopathy. Vitals were normal. The weight and height falls between 50th to 75th centile, and BMI was also normal, 17.2. The fundus was normal. Head to foot examination, there was no features of rickets seen, no mucocutaneous candidiasis, vitiligo, alopecia, no subcutaneous hard nodules, short stubby fingers, and chopstick and Draussia sign was positive. It's a child with tetany, possibly due to hypocalcemia, with no features of rickets. So we kept a differential diagnosis of vitamin D deficiency, nutritional or secondary cause, dietary calcium deficiency. It could be a hereditary or acquired hypoparathyroidism, hypomagnesemia, and pseudo hypoparathyroidism. So we started the evaluation. On investigation, the serum calcium was 4.9 milligram per deciliter. So the hypoalbuminemia shows falsely low total calcium level. For every 1 gram fall in albumin, total calcium falls by 0.8. For our child, the albumin level is normal. Alkalosis lowers ionic calcium level and acidosis raises ionic calcium level. For our child at a pH of 7.4, the ionized calcium is 0.7 millimoles per liter. So the normal ionized calcium is 1.0 to 1.4 millimoles per liter. So it is a low ionized calcium. We took a LFT to rule out secondary causes of vitamin D deficiency, obstructive cholestatic jaundice, and defect in bile acid metabolism. The ALP was elevated. The ALP is elevated due to the alkaline phosphatase is secreted by osteoblast, liver, kidney. In hypocalcemia, there is a secondary elevation of parathormone, which causes due to increase the serum calcium by resorption of bone by osteoclast activity. So there will be a compensatory increase to bone formation by osteoblast. So the ALP is elevated. The RFT was normal. The serum electrolytes, PS, CBC was normal. The urinary calcium creatinine was 0.05. If it is more than 0.2, it indicates hypercalciuria. So PTH, if it is low, it could be a hereditary or acquired hypoparathyroidism or hypomagnesemia. If it is high, it could be a vitamin deficiency, vitamin D, VDDR type 1 or VDDR type 2, pseudo hypoparathyroidism or CKD. For our child, the PTH was 497.4 picogram per ml. So hereditary and acquired hypoparathyroidism was ruled out. Hypomagnesemia usually presents as tetany and seizure in infantile period. The causes are genetic, malabsorption, aminoglycosides. Mechanism of hypomagnesemia causing hypocalcemia is not clearly understood. Probably it impairs PTH release. The treatment is administration of magnesium promptly corrects both calcium and magnesium. For our child, the magnesium is 1.6 milligram per deciliter, which is normal, so it rules out hypomagnesemia. The VDDR type 1 and VDDR type 2 usually present at age of presentation is during the first 2 years of age or infancy, and they will have the features of rickets. As there is no features of rickets and our child is 10 years old, VDDR type 1 and type 2 is ruled out. In order to differentiate pseudo-hypoparathyroidism and vitamin D deficiency, we did a serum phosphorus level. If serum phosphorus level is high, it could be a pseudo-hypoparathyroidism. If it is low, it is a vitamin D deficiency. Pseudo-hypoparathyroidism, it is a genetic defect of PTH adenylate cyclase receptors. The serum PTH is elevated when the child is hypocalcemic or normocalcemic with elevated serum phosphorus. There are 4 types of pseudo-hypoparathyroidism. All will have elevated parathermone and phosphorus. PHP1A will have features of Albright hereditary osteodystrophy with the hypocalcemia, which is the most common, and PHP1B and 2 will have no bone abnormality and they will present with hypocalcemia. PHP1C is a mild variant of PHP1A. In Albright hereditary osteodystrophy, they will present with short stature, round faces, obesity, brachydactyly, intellectual impairment, and heterotropic calcification. The typical finding is short 4th and 5th metacarpals and metatarsals. Our child not had any feature. In our child X-ray, both hands was taken and which was normal. Then what is pseudo-hypoparathyroidism? These children will have Albright hereditary osteodystrophy finding with normal calcium and normal parathermone level. For our child, the serum phosphorus was very high. Is our child is PHP1B or 2? So as per textbook of Harrison's Principle of Internal Medicine, the diagnosis of PHP1A can be easily made out when there is a positive family history with the features of Albright hereditary osteodystrophy with hypocalcemia. But PHP1B and PHP2 present only with hypocalcemia, so the diagnosis is more complex and vitamin D deficiency must be excluded before such a diagnosis can be entertained. So we did a vitamin D. The total vitamin D was 18.7 nanogram per ml. It comes under insufficient level. In our child, even repeated serum phosphates levels tend to be in a higher range. So as per Sperling's pediatric endocrinology textbook, typically hypophosphatemia is more severe than hypocalcemia in vitamin D deficiency. So we suspected pseudo-hypoparathyroidism strongly. In one half of patients with the pseudo-hypoparathyroidism, amorphous deposits of calcium and phosphate were found in basal ganglia. So we did the CT brain. There were multiple foci of calcification in bilateral thalamus, lenticular and dentate nucleus. The TFT and serum testosterone level were normal. Finally, it's a child of pseudo-hypoparathyroidism. We treated the child with oral calcitriol at 0.04 microgram per kg per day and calcium at 150 mg per kg per day. They have less risk of treatment-related hypercalciuria as the distal DCT remained responsive to parathermone. To be followed up every 3 months for serum calcium, serum phosphate, and 24-hour calcium level. The parathermone to be maintained at 50 to 150 picogram per ml. If hypothyroid, to be supplemented with thyroxine, and if obesity, diet advice and advised diet restriction and regular physical exercise. On follow-up after 1 month, the child not had any further episodes of tetany with the serum calcium level of 8. A pseudo-hypoparathyroidism tetanic spasm, which was not due to inadequate sunlight. And thank you. Thanks.
Sarath, are you there?
Thank you, Jabin. The last presentation is from Department of Pulmonology, ICH, and requesting our fellow Abhi to share the screen and start presenting.
Audible, sir?
A little bit louder, Abhi.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible, sir?
Now audible. Start.
Dinesh, fellow in pediatric pulmonology, Department of Pulmonology and Institute of Child Health. I'm presenting these two cases of persistent pneumonia on behalf of Department of Pulmonology, Professor Dr. L. Sima, Dr. Sudhakar sir, Kalpana Sarath sir, and Arthak sir. Moving to case 1. This is a 50-day-old girl infant. First born of non-consanguineous marriage. Perinatal events were uneventful. Child is a term child, AGA, with a birth weight of 3.1 kg. Child was discharged at the day 3 of life. At the day 20 of life, child was again admitted with cough, fever, and breathlessness. Child was admitted elsewhere and evaluated for the same. X-ray revealed a homogeneous opacity in left upper and mid zone and a heterogeneous opacity in right lower zone. And in other investigations revealed neutrophilic leukocytosis and CRP and ESR are elevated. RFT and LFT are normal. Blood culture was sterile. The child was treated with oxygen, high-dose IV antibiotic, meropenem and vancomycin for 3 weeks. After that, the repeat X-ray showed non-resolving pneumonia, and clinically also child's fever, cough, and breathlessness persisted. So the child was subjected to CT chest, and the child was referred for further management. Child was received in ICH at 50 days of life with persisting fever, cough, breathlessness. Present weight was 3.5 kg with a birth weight of 3.1 kg. There is 400 gram weight gain in 45 days. No history of oily stools. These were our investigation. On arrival, child was tachypneic with saturation of 95% in room air. Respiratory system examination revealed reduced ARN3 on left side, otherwise normal. Other system examination was normal. Our investigations also revealed neutrophilic leukocytosis with anemia, with the CRP and ESR elevated, and the blood culture was sterile. This was the CT chest. We reviewed the CT chest. CT chest revealed areas of necrosis within the consolidated area in both left upper lobe and right lower lobe. So the diagnosis of necrotizing pneumonia was. Now coming to the reason for non-resolving pneumonia, looking into microorganisms. Could there be an unusual organism or a tuberculosis or fungus? These were the things we considered. And MRSA, but the child received adequate antibiotic.
Not
and
audible,
appropriate antibiotic. Hello? Hello?
Proceed.
Audible, Dinesh, audible.
Coming to drug, the dosages were adequate. Looking into the host factors, these are the things that we considered. Is there any underlying immunodeficiency in presence of non-resolving pneumonia and neutrophilic leukocytosis? These are the immunodeficiency that we considered: leukocyte adrenal deficiency and CGD. LAD, but there is no skin infection and no delayed separation of umbilical cord, so less likely CGD possibility is present. And congenital malformation less likely, as there is multilobar involvement in both lungs. Cystic fibrosis, again, there is no history of oily stools, no dyslipidemia, stool fat globulins was negative. So at this point of time, our factors which we looked into were unusual organism, tuberculosis and fungi, and the possibility of underlying immunodeficiency. So we proceeded to look in search of organisms. So we proceeded with BAL. BAL, gram stain and bacteria cultures were normal, and CBNAT was negative. KOH and fungus sterile also, no growth. So we proceeded with ultrasound guided aspiration. You can see we aspirated from the right lower lobe. This ultrasound guided lung aspirate yielded an organism which was Aspergillus fumigatus, which is the signature organism for CGD. So we proceeded with NBT. NBT revealed reduced NBT activity, which is less than 5% in stimulated neutrophils. So the possibility of chronic granulomatous disease was, so diagnosis of chronic granulomatous disease was. So we treated the child with voriconazole, and the child improved clinically, radiologically, and the ESR also improved. These are the serial X-rays. You can see clearing of the pneumonia. But unfortunately, the child succumbed to another sepsis. Coming to the second child, this is a 2-year-old female child, third born of third-degree consanguineous marriage. Perinatal events were uneventful. Development was normal. This child presented to us with fever on and off for 6 months, which occurred 3 to 4 days per week, active in interfebrile period. There was no cough or breathlessness. History of recurrent oral ulcerations were present in the past 6 months. No history of arthritis or rash. No history of failure to thrive. Child's weight gain was good, appetite was good, and there was no contact. This child was again evaluated out elsewhere, and these were the initial investigation reports. Investigation revealed elevated total count with neutrophilic predominance. CRP and ESR were also elevated, and the TB workup was done. A MAN2 was positive, but RGJ CB0 was negative. So X-ray was done. X-ray didn't reveal much except for few paracardiac infiltrate not siloting the right heart border. So they proceeded with the CT chest. CT chest revealed right lower lobe pneumonia. So because of this, they treated the child with the ceftriaxone for 7 days, linezolid for 14 days, and child received a oral carfentanil for 7 to 14 days, and child also received oral steroids for 2 weeks. With this, child didn't improve. So because of the presence of MAN2 positivity, the child was started on ATT, and child received the ATT for about 1 month, but the dose was suboptimal. After 1 month of ATT, child's symptoms of persisting fever was present. So the child was subjected to repeat CT chest elsewhere. This repeat CT chest revealed increased infiltrate on the right lower lobe, and also there is a new infiltrate on the right middle lobe. So we received the child now. Now here is a child with a 6 months on and off fever and recurrent oral ulceration with MAN2 positivity. X-ray showing CT chest showing right lower lobe pneumonia. With after 1 month of suboptimal dose ATT, child is not responding. On examination, here child had oral candidiasis. After ulcer was present, no significant lymphadenopathy. Systemic examination was normal. These are the possibilities that we can consider. Infective, could it be due to tuberculosis, partially treated, whether the suboptimal response is due to suboptimal drugs, or can it be due to autoinflammatory syndrome in view of recurrent oral ulcer, but less likely as there was pneumonia. Inflammatory myofibroblastic tumor was considered, but the CT chest was more in favor of pneumonia than in Moss lesion. Underlying immunodeficiency was considered in view of non-resolving pneumonia and neutrophilic leukocytosis and also oral candidiasis. So at this point, we were thinking in terms of either partially treated tuberculosis or any underlying immunodeficiency. So we proceeded and evaluated in that direction. So this was our investigation, which revealed leukocytosis with neutrophilic predominance. CRP and ESR was elevated. CB0 was negative from ball. So we started the child on proper dose ATD. Meanwhile, we sent a PAD workup and plan to review the child. During follow-up, child's fever spikes is settled, and we received the PAD workup also. Immunoglobulin profile revealed hypergamma-globulinemia. In the presence of hypergamma-globulinemia, neutrophilic leukocytosis, and persistent pneumonia, probable tuberculosis, we also consider CGD. So proceeded with NBT. NBT, this was a control where there is a reduction in NBT, which can be revealed as blue deposits in neutrophils. Whereas in test, in our patient, there is no blue deposition. So this was the NBT report. NBT activity is noticed in less than 5% of stimulated neutrophils, which is more in favor of CGD. So which confirmed our diagnosis. 0% of patient neutrophils are positive after so consistent with chronic granulomatous. Coming to patient aspect, CGD as characterized by infection in oxidase into area of superoxide generation. The common sites which are involved are lung and lymph nodes. Other than that, skin and liver. Most common infections which are associated with CGD are pneumonia and recurrent abscesses. Coming to pulmonary involvement in lung can be in terms of pneumonia, lung abscess, empyema, hilar lymphadenopathy, mulch pneumonia after exposure to fungal spores, or interstitial lung. The common organisms which are isolated are catalase or positive organism, which are most fungi, almost all fungi, and most bacteria. Most common organisms were Aspergillus, as we have seen in our case. Other than that, the Staph aureus, Burkholderia, separation, Nocardia can also cause. In other than that, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, atypical Mycobacterium disease. Recurrent abscess ulceration has been noted in CGD. Apart from infective complication, inflammatory complication and autoimmune complications can also occur in CGD. Colitis occurred in an increased frequency, that is 40% in CGD patient. Coming to clue to diagnosis, hypergammaglobulinemia can be present. Anemia of chronic disease can be present. Elevated ESR and CRP. Hypoalbuminemia has been present. Even it is present in 70% in GA involvement and also 25% without GA involvement. NPT and DHR can confirm the diagnosis. Coming to treatment aspect, lifelong antibacterial and antifungal prophylaxis, aggressive management of infection usually based on ESR. Then therapy of inflammatory complication, that is because of granuloma causing GI and genitourinary obstruction, where we can use oral prednisone. Vaccination in CGD, live bacterial vaccines are contraindicated, other vaccines can be given. Definitive treatment is hematopoietic stem cell transplantation and gene therapy. In ICH, so far currently we have 6 patients in our follow-up. Going to take home message. USG-guided lung aspiration can be considered in persistent pneumonia. Invasive aspergillosis is the synchronous organism in CGD. Persistent neutrophilia, hypergammaglobulinemia, and thrombocytosis are clues for chronic granulomatous. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhi. Let us go to the chat box now. Few questions from chat box. And with regard to a case of aplastic anemia, what is the role of IVIG in these cases? Is there any empirical role of IVIG in these pancytopenia cases involving bone marrow? Question to Dr. Edison.
So we gave, hello?
Yes, boss.
Yes, sir. We gave IVIG in a child because we suspected it could be due to a transient bone marrow suppression, secondary to an infectious cause. So, but since there was no response to IVIG, we proceeded further, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And about other questions were answered by your team. Okay, thank you. And then a question to Dr. Nisha. Is there any role of doing dimer periodically to assess the risk of thrombotic tendency? Is there any guidelines in pediatrics at least?
Sir, am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are audible, ma.
Yes, sir. Sir, D-dimer serially we can monitor, sir, but as per our guidelines, D-dimer elevation alone is not a criteria to start on low molecular weight heparin. Our guideline says low molecular weight heparin indications are only 3, sir. EF of less than 35%, coronary dilation with a Z score of more than 10, and one more is thrombosis, frank thrombosis. Only these 3 are indications for low molecular weight heparin, sir. Guidelines as such have not mentioned elevated D-dimer anywhere, sir, so far.
Okay, thank you, ma. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. If any of our senior professors wanted to ask any question, they can add, no issues.
Pseudo hypoparathyroidism, where the parents' PTH level was checked. That's for the Stanley.
Frederick?
No, ma'am, we didn't check for the parents.
Usually, if you have a very well-built and tall parents, you have to screen them.
Okay, ma'am.
I have a question to Abhinesh. Abhinesh Sarat. Yeah. So, how often do you do this USG guided aspiration? Is this the first time or have you done earlier too?
This is the first time.
First time. That's what I haven't heard Sarat at least presenting in the past. Yeah, that was a real, good move so that you could establish the diagnosis. Yeah, so that's congratulations to your team on getting it done.
And Sharad, on similar line for the CGD case, how often, how good is this NBT test?
Sir, if clinically fits in.
It is only a screening test.
Yeah.
DHR is confirmatory.
Yeah, yes, sir. As Madam told, DHR is the confirmatory test, but a properly done NBT test. NBT test done here both in KKCTH as well as in Apollo. If the values, if the number of neutrophil reduced by the NBT, that is the percentage of reduction after stimulation, if it is less than 5%, definitely we need to take into consideration. Even though it is said that NBT is a screening test, so far to our knowledge, it is a reliable test if it is properly done in the presence of.
Usually correlates very well.
It correlates very well, sir. Definitely. And it can be done easily. We do not need any flow cytometry, everything. It can be done by a properly trained microbiologist. To our knowledge, it's a very good test, sir. Abhi, would you like to add something?
Sir, you said it is a very good test. It has very good sensitivity when done upon.
And we would like to add one more point with respect to this case, sir. As far as any CGD is concerned, there will be exuberant neutrophilic leukocytosis throughout the body, as a result of which almost all the microorganisms will be engulfed by the neutrophils, and it will be present inside the neutrophils rather than in bloodstream. As a result of which, it will be very, 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 very difficult to have a culture positivity in all cases of CGD, wherever it may be. That's why the treatment of a CGD will be based on the ESR. So we usually change antibiotics based on the ESR. That's why we will add, if ESR response is if ESR is quite still high, we would like to add some other antibiotic. If the ESR is low, then we will try to keep the same antibiotic as such. Second point. Third point is here, this is the first case we tried a lung aspirate, because in the beginning we did not really know. At the time of doing a lung aspirate, we really did not know whether we are dealing with a case of primary immunodeficiency or not. That's why we wanted to know really whether there is an organism present inside or not. To our knowledge, the presence of invasive aspergillosis is a marker for a chronic granulomatous disease. So even at the time of doing lung aspirate, the PG was having the result with him. Unfortunately, we could see the result after doing a lung aspirate. Definitely, it will be. We need to thank our radiologist, Dr. Gopinath, too. It is definitely a reliable, easy procedure. It can be done easily without doing much harm to the child and without giving much anesthesia, etc.
Thanks, Sharad.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Abhinesh, was Al-Galactomannan was done?
No, it was not done. Just British.
Double ledu.
Sir, on the same note, any genetic tests were planned, Dr. Bina? No, actually. So that's one point which I want to stress. Even if you're not going ahead with genetic tests, at that point you can just store the DNA. So invariably, these are all young parents. In another 2 years or so, they will come with a pregnancy, and at that time it becomes very difficult. If they are non-consanguineous, you will have to screen both the parents. So if you can just store DNA, you need not do the testing because you have a clinical diagnosis now. You could just store the DNA for a minimal amount. It's around within 2,000 rupees for 2 to 5 years. You can store the DNA. So we can use that for genetic information later on.
Thanks for the nice message, ma'am. We will try to do We'll try to do genetic test probably through NIH Mumbai. We will request them. If at all we get the result.
Yes, I think they are doing on a research basis too. So if you store DNA, you can send it anytime.
Sure.
So that is the point I want you to
Second case is alive. First case is no more. We will try to do it. And with respect to that RPGN, question to Dr. Abhirami. What is the need to prefer rituximab over cyclophosphamide in this case?
So, current studies shows that combination of rituximab with cyclophosphamide will reduce the duration of cyclophosphamide to be given, and also the steroids for induction of remission. It will cause yearly remission.
Okay. Almost as far as potency is concerned, both are non-inferior to each other. Na?
Yes, sir, but compared to side effect wise, and it is better, sir.
Okay. Thanks a lot. We need to thank all the presenters and the concerned team. I hope we will have another session next month. Over to Dr. Janani ma'am and Dr. Edel ma'am to add a final note.
Yeah, I think all the presentations were really good, and we learned a lot of new things. Regarding the accommodation of presentations, it's not first come, first served. We are just trying to accommodate all the institutions, trying to give chance to everyone. So a particular institution cannot keep sending cases. ICH and KKCTH, because of the number of postgraduates and because of the number of units, we thought we'll accommodate 2 from ICH, 2 from KKCTH. The remaining institutions, only 1 per institution. So that is what we have been doing, and I think Edel ma'am will agree. We want to give chance to everyone. So otherwise, we'll have only ICH, KKCTH, Srihar, and Rainbow in all the meets. Others will not be presenting. Yeah. So I think hope you all agree with that.
Yeah, we agree.
So whatever was not accommodated this time will be accommodated next time. Yeah. Ma'am,
yeah, I agree, Janani. Yeah, we thought we will not exceed 2 for KKCTH and ICH, and we will try to accommodate everybody at least 1, so that send to both of us, and that final will be so that at least minimum 1 from the other institutions. Definitely.
In the event that ICH and KKCTH submits only 1, then we'll give opportunity to others more.
Yeah, definitely. It is just not to exceed 8.
So maximum is only 8. Only 8 for each meet, not more than that.
Yeah.
Okay, Sharath, agreed?
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
Yeah, only then we have adequate time for interaction, and otherwise, no, more than 1.5 hours, no one will be willing to listen.
Almost.
I think we should really thank the presenters and the team, because they are keeping us going in these tough times. So really, thanks.
Really, very, very well. All the cases were really worked up very well. And good messages. Good messages.
The Dina's case and all, I don't think we would have heard the infantile presentation of spinocerebellar ataxia and all that. So
yes. Very, very nice. All of them were very nice. All
thank you, ma'am. Example. So we learned so much in these things. Pediatric. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
So thanks to Sarath for continuous support by sharing the Zoom link and by coordinating the meets every month. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sharath, and everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye. All of you stay safe. Take care.
Yeah.
COVID is very much within us.